Call the Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. We will oppose this legislation in the House. We will oppose it in the other place. We'll oppose it on several grounds. We'll oppose it because we do not believe the Minerals Resource Rent Tax should be repealed. And we'll oppose it because we believe the other measures included in this bill certainly should not be repealed. This bill is called the Minerals Resource Rent Tax Repeal Bill. It could just as easily be called the Schoolkids Bonus Repeal Bill. It could be called the Low Income Superannuation Contribution Repeal Bill. It could be called the Small Business Tax Increase Bill. It could be the Abolition of Accelerated Depreciation for Cars Bill. It could be called any number of things. Of course, the government has chosen to call it the Minerals Resource Rent Tax Repeal Bill. We'll deal with each of these items in turn. The Minerals Resource Rent Tax is, of course, the centrepiece of the bill. Now, on this side of the House, we believe a profits-based tax on profits from the mineral sector, minerals which belong to the Australian people, is a good reform. It's not to say it doesn't have its challenges in implementation, doesn't have its challenges in design, but to say, as those opposite do, that it should be abolished is something we don't agree with at all. Now, those opposite say, they said it was a dagger at the heart of the prosperity of Australia. They said it would raise so much money that it would cripple the mineral sector in Australia. Now they say it should be abolished because it hasn't raised enough. Well, they can't have it both ways. Now, of course, reform is always difficult, Mr Deputy Speaker. Those opposite said that it would make projects unviable. And I challenge any government speaker tonight, or in the vast hour or so that they've deigned to allow for debate, in this debate, to outline which projects have not proceeded because the Minerals Resource Rent Tax is in place. Name a project, name a venture, name a mining project which has not proceeded. I would be very interested to hear from honourable members opposite. I saw the honourable member for Moncrieff a few weeks ago on telly, on The Nation, on Sky, and he said, of course, the Minerals Resource Rent Tax has stopped projects proceeding. And I saw David Spears, the host, say, "Could you name one?" And there was this long, awkward pause we occasionally see on television, Mr Deputy Speaker. The member for Moncrieff indicated he didn't have one at hand, but he was sure that there was one somewhere. Now, reform is never easy. Difficult reforms are always worth fighting for. But we have to draw on history. Of course, the Minerals Resource Rent Tax isn't the first time that a government has attempted to implement a profits-based tax on resource issues. We saw a previous government, the Hawke Labor government, introduce the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax for exploration which occurs off our coast for exploitation of what is also Australia's natural resources and offshore petroleum enterprises. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this, Mr Deputy Speaker, because it's instructive. In this House, the Hawke Labor government had to fight very hard to see the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax introduced. The Hawke Labor government said that this resource, which belongs to all Australians, should provide a revenue stream for all Australians. I went back and had a look at that debate because it's very, very instructive. And somebody who then held the office that I now hold, Shadow Treasurer, said this: "Nothing could better illustrate the counterproductive nature of the Hawke government's energy policies. The Hawke government's RRT will effectively destroy the incentive for offshore exploration." That was the then Shadow Treasurer, who was John Howard, who argued that this resource rent tax would stop ventures proceeding and should not be proceeded with. And then we had the then member for Mayo, that economic genius Mr Downer, who said the legislation is yet another example of this government introducing new taxes on the few productive industries we have left in Australia, thereby inhibiting their development. The few productive industries we have left in Australia. Well, there's an optimistic view for you from the future Foreign Minister. And if you look through the Hansard of that debate. It was a long and bitter debate. And I could have, Mr Deputy Speaker, not told you it was from the PRRT debate, and you would have thought it was from the MRRT debate. They're the sorts of things that those opposite said at the time about the PRRT, they've said since about the MRRT. See, Mr Everingham, who I have a vague recollection of, who sat opposite, said this: "This government's determination to find every means to extract dollars from the industry to prop up its disastrous record of economic management threatens the very livelihood of the oil exploration industry." You see, Mr Deputy Speaker, members opposite at that time said the PRRT would be such a disincentive for growth that it would destroy the petroleum industry in Australia, and they fought it, they resisted it with all the energy they could muster. Except one little problem for those members opposite. It passed both houses at that time. It went on, of course, not to provide a disincentive for investment, and has raised for the Australian people in the time since then, in 2013 dollars, $39 billion. And of course, we had the Howard government come and go. I don't recall an attempt to repeal the petroleum resource rent tax. We now see the Abbott government in office. I haven't seen a bill come before the House to abolish the petroleum resource rent tax because, of course, Deputy Speaker, history tells us the petroleum resource rent tax didn't have the adverse consequences that Tories at the time said it would, didn't have the chilling effect on investment that they said it would. But it did do this. It raised for the Australian people $39 billion in 2013 dollars since it was introduced. A good reform. A reform that the Hawke government had to fight for. A reform that the Hawke government had to argue for. A reform that was done in good time so that a subsequent Conservative government could not repeal it. Now, unfortunately, we see this Conservative government repealing the MRRT. But they're also not just repealing the MRRT in this piece of legislation. They're repealing a whole range of other measures, which I'll deal with sequentially, Deputy Speaker. Firstly, we see this government attempting to repeal in this legislation the low-income superannuation contribution. Now, more than any other measure, the repeal of the low-income superannuation contribution tells us about the priorities of this government. But it tells us even more than the priorities. It tells us about their values. It tells us about the values of this government. As you know, Deputy Speaker, most Australians get a tax concession for saving for the future, saving through superannuation, as they should. Most Australians receive it, but not all. Now, high-income earners receive a tax concession for saving for the future, and they should. But in the previous government, we thought that it was fundamentally unfair that low and middle-income earners receive zero tax concession for saving for the future. 1 in 3 Australian workers, Deputy Speaker, receive not one bit of assistance to save for their future through the superannuation system. And we thought that that was unfair, and we think it's unfair now. But we didn't just think it was unfair, we did something about it. So the low-income superannuation contribution effectively means that people under $37,000 now get a tax concession for saving through superannuation. They actually get some benefit out of the tax system for putting money aside for the future. Now, I would again invite honourable members opposite who are going to speak in this debate to explain to the House and to the Australian people why they think it's fair that somebody who might be a cleaner or a manufacturing worker or a shop assistant gets no assistance at all to save for their retirement through the superannuation system and the tax system. And it's even worse than that, Deputy Speaker, because this government is taking the low-income superannuation contribution away retrospectively. People, Australians who've saved money through the superannuation system, put money aside, got a tax concession already, are having it taken away by this government. Can you imagine the furore if this government attempted such a measure for high-income earners, or if any government attempted a retrospective tax on the superannuation of high-income earners, there would be a justifiable and justified outrage. But because low-income earners and middle-income earners have less of a voice in the national debate, this government thinks they can get away with it. Well, we're their voice, and we'll oppose this measure to repeal the low-income superannuation contribution. Low and middle-income earners have a right to be outraged that their tax concession on their superannuation savings is being ripped away by this government. And I said that this tells us about the values of the government, and it does. Because not in this bill, but in other measures, this government is reversing other tax changes of the previous government. They are providing a tax break to people who have more than $2 million in their superannuation accounts. Now, good luck to people who have more than $2 million in their superannuation accounts. Good luck. There's people in this House with more than $2 million in their superannuation accounts. Good luck to them. They should receive a tax break, but not the extraordinarily generous tax breaks that this government intends to give them, at the same time as taking away tax breaks from people throughout Australia who are working away quietly in their shops, in their factories, trying to save a bit for the future. Now, I oppose class warfare in all its forms, and this is class warfare from this government, giving a tax break to people with more than $2 million in their superannuation accounts and taking it away from Australians who earn less than $37,000. Now, I don't suggest that they raise the same amount of money, because they don't. I don't suggest that you could do, if you didn't do one, you wouldn't have to do the other, because that doesn't equate. But it equates when it comes to values and priorities. It equates when it comes to what's important in this House. And it's important in this House that low and middle income earners receive some support for saving for the future. And, Deputy Speaker, this tax grab by this government on low and middle income earners has a particularly adverse effect on females in the workforce. It's not just because females, even still in 2013, receive a lower average pay than males. It's not just because of that. It's because females in the workforce have a more interrupted working life. They have more things which take them out of the workforce, most particularly having children. And even with paid parental leave, many mothers stay out of the workforce for longer than 12 months, and therefore they have an extremely interrupted working life. That means they don't have the period in the workforce to build for their retirement. And so the low-income superannuation contribution is a chance to give them a bit of a leg up as they save for their retirement, so that when they hit retirement age, they've got something to fall back on. What's unfair about that? I invite again honourable members to explain to the House, those opposite, to explain to us, why do you think that somebody under $37,000 of income deserves zero support through the tax system to save for their retirement? Zero support. They're not just reducing the support through the tax system, they're not just taking a bit away, they are abolishing the tax concession, the only tax concession that goes to low and middle income workers under $37,000. And it's not in the national interest. When you combine the abolition of the low-income superannuation contribution with another measure in this bill, which is to delay the increase in superannuation from 9% to 12%, then that will reduce our national savings by $53 billion by 2021-22. Now, we all know that this Prime Minister doesn't really understand superannuation and doesn't really support superannuation. He stood in this House, somewhere over here in the opposition, when the increase in superannuation was introduced, and called Australia's superannuation system, it was actually after it was introduced, he did it in a German debate, as I recall, called Australia's superannuation system the biggest con job in Australian history. He doesn't support superannuation. The Prime Minister doesn't understand that superannuation is the way to remove people from welfare through their retirement and give them a chance to save for their future. The Prime Minister fundamentally doesn't understand that. He said it here in this House. He doesn't really support moving from 9 to 12. And I say this, I hope that this delay doesn't become a cancellation. When the government says, oh, it's all too much harder than we thought, we're going to have to cancel this increase from 9% to 12%. They've done it before. They promised the Australian people in 1996 they'd move the superannuation guarantee from 9% to 12%, and they reneged on that promise. And they reneged on that promise in 1996. It pays to listen to the debate before interjecting. In 1996, they promised the Australian people they would not interfere with the increase to 12%, and they reneged on that promise. This brings me, Deputy Speaker, to some of the other measures in this bill. Another measure in this bill is to remove the increase of the previous government in the instant asset write-off of small business. It sounds like some sort of arcane tax measure, and maybe it is. But it's actually a small business tax cut, which the previous government introduced. And it was a measure to reduce red tape compliance burden on small business. When Labor came to office in 2007, small businesses could write off any investment under $1,000 without all the red tape burden which normally goes with that. And the previous government increased that threshold to $6,500, so that there was much more that small business could just write off without the red tape burden. And at the last election we had a commitment to increase it further to 10%. But this bill takes it back to 2007 levels, back to $1,000. Now, we hear a lot from this government about small business. They say that they're the party of small business. We hear a lot about red tape. Strong on rhetoric, short on action. Not only that, counterproductive action. This government, in one of the first pieces of legislation they're bringing before the House, increasing taxes on small business and increasing their red tape burden. Increasing taxes on small business by $1 billion and increasing the red tape burden on any small business that chooses to make an investment between $1,000 and $6,500 and now has not only the cash flow impact but the red tape impact. I wonder if the member for Kooyong is going to speak in this debate, the member who's been tasked by the Prime Minister for cutting red tape. Is he going to support this measure which will increase the red tape burden on Australia's small businesses? Well, we'll oppose this measure because we don't actually believe just in the rhetoric of small business, we believe in action to support it. And we're proud of our pro-small business reforms. We saw this red tape burden lifted from small business, which this government's going to reimpose. And it's not just us that say this. The Australian Industry Group said of the increase in the threshold of the small business asset write-off that it will, quote, add complexity and compliance costs for eligible small businesses. So this change in the law will increase red tape, affect cash flow, and at a time when the government needs to be looking to boost non-mining investment, as investment in the mining sector winds down, it will be a stymie to investment from the small business sector. This is a very significant measure that this government is seeking to abolish. It will increase taxes on up to 2.7 million small businesses. And it's not just that, Deputy Speaker. This bill also abolishes the lost carryback. Again, it might sound like an arcane tax measure. Lost carryback is a measure, not just for small business, which encourages innovation, which encourages a bit of risk-taking, which says if you make a loss in one particular year, well, you can take that into account in future years. I would have thought it's something this government would embrace. With all their rhetoric about entrepreneurism and innovation and risk-taking and private enterprise, would have thought they'd embrace this measure. Would have congratulated the previous government for introducing it, but no. We see them abolishing it in the first sitting fortnight. This is a hit to businesses of almost $1 billion over the next 4 years. And then we get, Deputy Speaker, to the accelerated depreciation of motor vehicles for small business. Now again, we've heard a lot from this government about the importance of the car industry, about the importance of tax treatment for the car industry. Well, this would allow a small business an immediate $5,000 deduction for a vehicle costing $6,500 or more. So don't lecture us about the car industry, Deputy Speaker, when this accelerated depreciation has been taken away by this government. an impost on small business and an impost on the car industry. Let's see this impost play through the car industry, and we'll be having a bit to say about that and holding the government to account for its impacts. So we're not going to be lectured by this government about fringe benefits tax or any other measure when this government, this new government, is actually abolishing the accelerated depreciation for small business for motor vehicles. And the final matter I'm going to speak about, Deputy Speaker, is one that I know is very close to the heart of the member for Jagajaga, who's joined us in the chamber, and that's the Schoolkids Bonus.
That's right.
Now, we hear a lot about cost of living, as we should.
Thank you.
We heard a lot about cost of living before the election. We hear a lot about cost of living after the election. We get lectured in this chamber about what we should do about cost of living. Well, let's have a talk about cost of living. Let's have a talk about government measures to support families dealing with the cost of living. Well, I think something that helps families deal with the cost of living is $410 a year for primary school students and $820 for high school students. And that amounts, if a family has 2 children, over the course of their schooling life, to $15,000.
That's right.
I think that might help them with the cost of living just a little bit, Deputy Speaker. I think that might actually help families deal with the costs of sending their children to school. And I think that taking $4.5 billion out of the pockets of Australian families might be something we might want to talk about in the cost of living debate. We might not want to be lectured by this mob, Deputy Speaker, about cost of living when they are putting legislation into this House to take away $15,000 from Australia's families. Now we hear from the government about, well, of course, the minerals resource rent tax hasn't made as much as we thought or you thought it was predicted, and therefore we've got to abolish this measure. Well, there's one little problem with the government's equation. The minerals resource rent tax was never designed to pay for the Schoolkids Bonus.
That's it.
The minerals resource rent tax, if you look at the announcements at the time, was never paying for the Schoolkids Bonus.
Right.
Completely separate policies. This government, if they want to abolish the Schoolkids Bonus, had the guts to put it in separate legislation, bring it into the House, bring it in the other place and see how you go. Try your luck. Try your luck, because it was not paid for by the minerals resource rent tax. Never was. So how dare this government incorporate it in the same legislation? A, don't talk to us about cost of living when you're taking money away from Australia's families with school children. And B, putting it in the same legislation when it was never paid for by the minerals resource rent tax. The Schoolkids Bonus was designed to replace the education tax rebate introduced by this government. That's where it came from. And I looked through the legislation and I thought, well, maybe if they're abolishing the Schoolkids Bonus, maybe at least they're reintroducing the education tax rebate. No,
they're not.
While I'm at it, Deputy Speaker, the accelerated depreciation of motor vehicles, which I talked about before, that was replacing the entrepreneur's tax offset. Not reintroduced by this legislation either. Same problem. So this government has some consistency issues to deal with. I really look forward to hearing from honourable members opposite, because they've got some explaining to do.
Especially when they front up to their parents.
They've got to explain to Australian families how taking money away from the Schoolkids Bonus is going to help the cost of living. They've got to explain to Australia's low and middle income earners why they think it's fair. Every single one of them over there thinks it's fair that they should get zero tax concession for saving for their retirement. Zero! Why they think that somebody with $2 million in their superannuation accounts deserves quite a good tax concession, thank you very much, but somebody on $37,000 or less deserves not a bit less, zero tax concession to save for their retirement. Well, we think it's unfair, and we'll vote accordingly. We'll vote accordingly because this is a debate about values. Not just priorities, about values. Our values tell us that the Schoolkids Bonus is important. Our values tell us that the low-income superannuation contribution is important. Our values tell us that the small business tax concessions are important, because we don't actually just talk about small business. We don't have empty rhetoric about how they're the backbone of the nation. We actually do things that actually help small business, and this government's taking them away. Taking them away. So my challenge to the government is this in their contributions. Tell us why it's fair. Tell us why it's better for small business that they don't have the increased threshold for the instant asset write-off. Tell Australia's families why it's fair that they lose the school kids bonus. Tell Australia's hard-working middle-income and low-income earners why they should receive zero tax concessions for their superannuation. When they tell the Australian people that, I think the Australian people will have a fair bit to say about it, and will certainly be having plenty to say about it in this debate in the weeks and months and years to follow.
Yeah.